close your eyes. Right now. Really do it. Imagine the sun rising tomorrow morning, and then nothing. Not a cloud covering it, not a storm rolling in. The sun is there, glowing weak and pathetic, like a dying candle at the end of a funeral. You can see it, but you can't feel it. The heat never comes. The light is dim and sickly, like it's coming from behind 1,000 layers of dirty glass. And this isn't going away. This isn't a bad week or a bad month. This is your reality for the next 18 months. 18 months of twilight. No day ever gets bright. No night ever gets dark. Just endless, soul-crushing gray. Your crops are already confused. Plants are dying. Animals are starving. And then the temperature drops. In summer, snow starts falling. August. August! Your neighbors are already talking about starving. And the worst part? Nobody knows why. Nobody. The world has literally gone insane, and everyone has decided. The answer must be that God has abandoned you. But they're wrong. The answer is so much darker. To find the most miserable year in human history, we have to travel to 536 AD, the year the sun died. Here's the thing about 536. It wasn't a plague year. It wasn't a war year. It was worse. It was the year that physics itself betrayed humanity. Somewhere around late 535 or early 536, a volcanic eruption occurred. Maybe in Iceland, maybe in North America. We're not entirely sure, because nobody back then was taking notes for future historians. But what we do know is that this wasn't just any volcano. This was a catastrophe on a scale that our brains struggle to comprehend. A massive explosion sent millions of tons of ash and sulfur dioxide high into the atmosphere. When I say high, I mean it went into the stratosphere, and from there it spread. Not just across the Mediterranean, not just across Europe. It wrapped around the entire northern hemisphere like a suffocating blanket. The sun didn't disappear. It was still there, but the light coming from it was filtered through layers of volcanic particles so thick that noon looked like dusk, and then dusk looked like pitch black at only 3 in the afternoon. A Persian historian at the time wrote, "The sun gave forth its light without brightness. It seemed exceedingly like the sun in eclipse, for the beams it shed were not clear." Imagine reading that as someone living through it. The sun isn't bright anymore. That's not poetry. That's absolute horror. The temperature dropped. And I mean dropped. Historical records from China describe snow falling in summer. In May. In June. In July. In August. August, the grain that was supposed to feed millions started to die in the fields. Trees couldn't grow properly. In some regions, harvests dropped by 70 to 80%. 70 to 80%. That's not a bad year for farming. That's starvation. Global. Systematic, inevitable starvation. And nobody understood why. There was no Facebook to tell people what happened. No news broadcasts. No internet. People just knew that something catastrophic had happened, and they had no idea what. So, what did they conclude? Obviously, God was angry. The end of the world was coming. The apocalypse had arrived. And honestly, from their perspective, they weren't entirely wrong. This was the apocalypse, just not the religious kind. Here's where it gets worse. And trust me, it does get worse. One bad harvest? Okay, you tighten your belt. People have survived famines before. But 536 didn't just have one bad harvest. It had years of them. The darkness lasted for 18 months, but the effects lasted for a decade. For 10 years, the climate was unstable. For 10 years, crops failed across the known world. For 10 years, people starved. In China, so many people died that entire cities were abandoned. Graveyards ran out of room. The government eventually stopped, keeping records of the death toll because the numbers were incomprehensible. In Europe, the famine was so severe that people started eating things that shouldn't be eaten. Let's not get graphic here, but let's just say that when you're starving enough, morality becomes a luxury good. One writer at the time said, "For the whole world, as it were, took on the aspect of a dark and obscure countenance." But famine alone wouldn't have been enough to make 536 the worst year ever. Because in 541, just as people thought they'd survived the worst, something darker emerged. The plague of Justinian arrived. A disease so catastrophic that it would reshape civilization. We're talking about a plague that killed somewhere between 25 and 50 million people. Some historians estimate it wiped out half the population of the Mediterranean world. The plague didn't just kill people. It destroyed empires. Whole armies couldn't be raised because there were no soldiers left. Trade networks collapsed because there was no one left to trade. The Byzantine Empire, once mighty and proud, was reduced to a shadow of itself. The world didn't recover from 536 for decades. For some regions, it took centuries. And the worst part? It all happened because of a volcano. One volcano changed the course of human civilization. One natural disaster killed more people than any war up until that point. One moment, in one place, sent a ripple of death across the entire planet. If this story freaks you out, and honestly, it should, then you need to be subscribed right now. Because the worst parts of history aren't in textbooks. They're not in mainstream documentaries. They're here, locked away, forgotten, waiting to be discovered. Every week, we dig through the darkest, most hidden chapters of human history. The stuff that will make you rethink everything you thought you knew. The events that shaped your world. So hit that subscribe button. Not later. Now. And if you're already subscribed, prove it by smashing that notification bell so you never miss an upload. But before we continue, I have a question for you. What's one modern invention you could absolutely not live without? If you were suddenly transported to 536 AD, what would you desperately wish you had? Drop your answer in the comments below. I'm reading them. I'm responding. Let's see what you got. Now, let's get back to the darkness. But here's the thing that gets me. People survived. Not easily. Not happily. But they survived. And understanding how they survived through this tells you something about human beings that you won't learn anywhere else. First, let's talk about the psychology of living in constant twilight. Depression wasn't named yet, but trust me, everyone had it. Imagine never seeing true sunlight. Imagine your brain being flooded with darkness for 18 consecutive months. Your circadian rhythm is destroyed. You can't sleep properly because your body doesn't know if it's day or night. You're exhausted all the time. And the vitamin D deficiency? Forget about it. People were getting weaker, their bones were getting softer, and their immunity was crashing. But they kept moving. They had to. The alternative was death. So what did they do? They adapted. In some places, people migrated south, hoping for better conditions. In others, they dug deeper, literally. They created underground storage for the food they could still produce. They learned to preserve things in ways that would have seemed impossible before. They became more nomadic, following whatever herds hadn't died yet. And spiritually, this is where it gets interesting. People's faith transformed, or broke. Some became more religious, convinced that this was divine punishment, and only prayer could save them. Others abandoned faith entirely, concluding that if God existed, he had obviously abandoned them. Entire religions evolved because of this period. This was the beginning of the Christian Dark Ages. For the next 1,000 years, European civilization would be fragmented and broken, trying to rebuild from the ashes of what 536 created. And through all of it, people persisted. They didn't have food security. They didn't have government aid. They didn't have science explaining what was happening. They just had desperation and determination, and somehow that was enough. Enough to survive. Enough to eventually rebuild. Enough to eventually give birth to future generations, including you. Here's what keeps me up at night thinking about 536. We live in the most privileged time in human history. Even our bad days are incomprehensibly better than their good days. When you're tired of your job, you don't starve. When you're sick, you take medicine. When you're cold, you turn up the heat. When you're hungry, you go to a store. When you're depressed, you can actually talk to a therapist. Your worst year would be their best year. Your worst week would be their best month. We have food security. That would seem like magic to someone from 536. We have medicine. That would seem like witchcraft. Which, ironically, is exactly why people got accused of witchcraft back then when they actually knew how to use herbs. We have electric light that turn night into day whenever we want. We have communication that lets us talk to someone on the other side of the world in seconds. And yes, we have our problems. Climate change is real. Political polarization is real. Economic inequality is real. But we're not staring at a sun that's been reduced to a dying ember in the sky. We're not watching our children starve because crops failed. We're not convinced that we're living in the literal end times. We're not living through a plague that kills half our friends and family. So, the next time you're having a bad day, the next time you feel like your life is unbearable, remember 536. Remember people who had nothing. Remember ancestors who survived the unsurvivable. Remember that your suffering, however real, is still a luxury compared to what they endured. And use that gratitude as fuel. Use it to appreciate what you have. Use it to push harder for what you want. Use it to treat the people around you better. Because if our ancestors could survive 536, we can survive anything. 536 AD wasn't just a bad year. It was a nightmare that stretched into a decade. It was a time when the world was literally and figuratively in the dark. 18 months of darkness, 10 years of famine, millions upon millions of deaths. But humanity didn't disappear. We didn't give up. We didn't accept extinction. We survived. We adapted. We rebuilt. And that's the real story here. Because you're here. I'm here. Every single person alive today exists because our ancestors refused to quit when quitting would have been so much easier. They didn't have YouTube to distract them. They didn't have social media to scroll through. They didn't have Netflix to binge. They had each other, basic shelter, whatever food they could scavenge, and pure, stubborn determination. And that's what got us to now. So thank you, 536 ancestors. Thank you for surviving the unsurvivable. Thank you for persisting through the impossible. Without you, without your refusal to give up, I wouldn't be here making videos. And you wouldn't be here watching them. If this video taught you something new about history, something that made you think, something that changed how you see the world, hit that like button. It signals to the algorithm that this content matters. And that helps us reach more people who need to see stories like this. Subscribe for more deep dives into the history we forgot. The stories that textbooks skip. The events that shaped our world. I'm your name, and you just experienced 536 AD, the year without light. I'll see you in the next one. Stay curious, stay informed, and never forget, we're stronger than we think.